Our final speaker is Jean Lambert, MEP.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. One of the roles that I have in the European Parliament is that I also chair Parliament's delegation for relations with 6 of the countries of South Asia, one of which is Pakistan, where of course the issue of drone strikes, the armed drones, has become an extremely big issue. And the current ambassador from Pakistan has talked in the Parliament about this now being a major cause of radicalisation in Pakistan. The New York Times has said that it's taken over from Guantanamo as a recruiting agent for certain, sort of on the ground forces there. And we know that Guantanamo itself is an incredible shame, ought to be shut down. It's a scandal that it still exists and is now in its 12th year. And when we can sort of see the impact as well that these drones, the very existence of the drones is actually having on the lives of so many, in so many countries. And we've heard more evidence in the Parliament, the European Parliament, from those affected in Pakistan, but who talk not only about the thousands of deaths of civilians and indeed military personnel there, but also that, that the whole sort of psychological pressure for people of having the sort of the buzzing, the circling, the never quite knowing when you're likely to be attacked is an enormous psychological burden on communities, not least, of course, the children. So these are horrendous things, the armed drones. We've been hearing that currently in the Parliament there's something like 30 countries that already have programs about unmanned programs. That there are now at least 76 countries that either have or are acquiring drone technology. And a view expressed in certain experts that we've heard that it's now become an indispensable factor in military operations. Now, some of these are sort of quite small, they're unsophisticated, but for those countries who are able to employ more sophisticated surveillance and armed remote control devices, it's more concentrated. And it has, a real, it's a game changer in weaponry, this technology. But I think we have to remember that at the moment this is not sort of remote in the sense that there is no human being involved in decision making with these weapons, with this technology. They're all controlled. We're told it's highly trained operators bound in the same manner, the same regulation, the same legislation as manned combat aircraft. And I think that's an important point to remember, that this is not something which just makes its own decisions and off it goes, yet anyway, that it's human beings involved, human beings who make the decisions, human beings who decide whether this is reconnaissance, whether it's used for humanitarian purposes, to assess flood damage, to assess refugee situations, or whether this is technology which is going to be armed and be a weapon of delivery. And that certainly the platforms that now exist, we're told, are capable of achieving a sort of complete set, as it were, described as the entire find, fix, track, target, engage, and assess kill chain. The whole system. And the indications are that, parallels with sort of ordinary aircraft, as it were, will not end there. But it's only the first generation of robotic systems in armed situations. And again, what study that was done for the European Parliament on this technology has said is that current systems are not comparable to upcoming technology. Unmanned systems, handheld, small drones, size of birds, able to deploy poison with very fast deployment times, systems that can autonomously identify and carry out an attack on suspected militants. And that this, is now sort of out there, it's beginning to turn up even, in crime fiction, Patricia Cornwall. It's something which, at one point you would have thought was science fiction. And certainly people see the trend as irreversible. And that it is, as I say, a potential game changer. That, the use is encouraged, is sort of increasingly global. And it's not like nuclear weaponry, something that necessarily sort of comes country by country. You try and set in place international sort of agreements to try and control the spread of that technology, and we know how successful that may or may not have been when you look at now what's happening, for example, with special treatment for India, which at one time was considered outside the, not able to access nuclear civilian technology because it had nuclear weapons outside the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's now been overturned because, after all, it's likely to be a big trading partner, and that the sanctions against Pakistan are weakening all the time. So, the very sort of widespread nature of this technology, and indeed its production, is going to be, I think, sets some very particular challenges. And it's not only the very small, sort of almost, individualized technology here. We're also looking at the people considering the development of even large-scale weaponry delivery, and of course, people really concerned about what it might mean in terms of chemical, biological, chemical, and nuclear weaponry as well, that might be operated in this way. And, what you also hear is as the systems proliferate, well, the costs come down. As if somehow this is a good thing, but of course what it means is you see an even wider spread. So it's a really worrying technology. And I think that, we've been sort of behind the development in so many ways in terms of actually recognizing what it means and what needs to be done. There's a whole set of legal questions that go along with this. Complicated because a lot of the strikes, as we've seen, don't come from in-country. They don't even come from countries that are what one would consider to be sort of at war in any sort of conventional sense. It's cross-border. The consent is often very opaque in terms of who is actually allowing strikes in particular countries. That, while governments on the one hand may say that they deplore the strikes, they deplore the deaths, on the other hand, it's never entirely quite clear whether they haven't also welcomed them because of who they believe they eliminate. So there are very significant legal and indeed, of course, ethical questions. And as I say, the complexity about who makes the decisions is part of this, and the law, therefore, that applies, let alone what one does about applying the law. And there are very particular questions for the UK. The Americans' position is that they see what's going on, for example, in terms of Pakistan across the border into Afghanistan or in Yemen or wherever, as that this is an armed conflict with Al-Qaeda as well as the Taliban and associated forces. It's a response to the 9/11 attacks and constitutes for them self-defense under international law. So Congress has authorized the use of all necessary and appropriate force through the 2001 authorization, which still remains in force. So you'll find American lawyers, some, who will argue that this is legitimate, the use of drone technology, the use of what some of us would see as indiscriminate killing, they would see as targeted against a particular enemy and therefore constitutes legality for them. That's a big argument that should be had in the States. But for the UK and its involvement, well, we don't have such legislation in place. We haven't overtly tried to, what some of us would see as subvert international law in order to allow use of such technology from the UK to supply information to the United States in its use of such technology. In fact, it's not really clear at all on what basis the UK is doing this. And therefore, there's certainly legal opinions being heard now that say it could well be that the UK is complicit in a war crime. And that those who are involved in making the decisions, in actually operating these systems, in actually delivering weapons into various countries, are complicit in a war crime. And of course, we're subject to the International Criminal Court in a way in which the United States is not subject. So the issues about transparency, what's the basis for the decision making? Accountability, who is it who makes these decisions on what grounds? What sort of legislation therefore applies? What's missing is a really big issue, which the House of Commons at long last seems as if it's starting to come to grips with, not least thanks to the work of the all-party group, an informal group, on drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, which was set up about a year ago now in the Parliament, had an early day motion there. It's pushed by people such as Tom Watson, George Galloway, Caroline Lucas, David Anderson, Sandra Osborne and John Hemmings were people who signed the original, set out the original early day motion to push for some sort of discussion, accountability, change in the law, and hopefully rollback. So they wanted to know on what basis is the UK sharing information with other states for the use of targeted killings? What are the human rights questions that arise from the direct and indirect use of drones? And the need for increased transparency and accountability. The Defence Committee in the House of Commons is now undertaking an inquiry on this, and written evidence had to be in by September, and that inquiry is now going on. So we'll see what comes from that. At the European level, we are also moving there, that certainly there's been research carried out, that's undergoing in their research programs, that a number of governments are very happy with that. They see that as a way of actually promoting the European defence industry, as if it needed promoting, and rather than using the money, as was said earlier, for much better causes. And again, we've got something coming up in the next few weeks. We had a hearing back earlier in the year from the subcommittees on human rights and defence and security. We're looking at what are some of the issues. We've got a hearing again in the Parliament next week. My colleague Barbara Lochbihler is holding. And we just heard that we've now managed to get what we call a recommendation, a resolution that will come to the Parliament either in December or January, coming from the different political groups via the Foreign Affairs Committee, saying to Council what Parliament's opinion is on this. And I would hope that that is going to be the strongest resolution possible, that will actually talk about the need for transparency, accountability, hopefully a diversion of the monies to actually do something more useful, but also to look at what should we be doing in terms of promoting international legislation in order to actually put some limits on this, to really try and ensure that the humanitarian side of unmanned technology can be used, but that we're not developing it, as we were hearing, as a sort of somehow a hands-off way of murdering more and more people, so that we don't see body bags coming back here, and we avoid seeing them altogether elsewhere in the world. Thank you.